I was born September 8th, 1941. My name is Bernie Sanders. I was born September 8th, 1941 in Brooklyn, New York. My dad, Eli, came to America from Poland, as did the parents of my mother, Dorothy. The rest, who stayed behind, were killed by socialists, National Socialists. My dad ran a small store, and my parents raised me and my older brother, Larry, in a rent-controlled apartment. We didn't have a lot of money, but I did have an imaginary friend. His name was Utopia, a magical creature who distributed resources from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. Utopia comforted me when I lost my first campaign for student body president, coming in third in a three-way race. I was able to avoid serving my country in Vietnam by going to college. Utopia came with me to college, where I read Karl Marx, joined the Young People's Socialist League, and hung out with communists. Surprisingly, none of that helped prepare me for an actual productive career. After college, I worked in a psychiatric hospital, taught preschool, and wrote articles about women's sexual fantasies. I even produced a short film about a lifelong hero, Eugene Debs, who ran for President of the United States 5 times on the ticket of the American Socialist Party. Welfare and unemployment checks paid my bills during this time, as did 4 of the women I lived with. Though life wasn't easy. My first wife, Deborah, was always on my case about not having a steady working-class job. Moron work, I called it. My girlfriend, Susan, and I had a baby. But Wall Street and greedy corporations rigged the system and made it impossible for me to make a decent living. I finally met Jane. She understood me and shared my commitment to Marxist ideals. After marrying, we thought, where would be the perfect place for a romantic honeymoon? The Soviet Union, of course. It was great. Utopia came with us to make sure we only saw what we wanted to see. Fancy theaters with puppets and chandeliers and subways, not the 20 million who died in famines and gulags and executions. We had such a great time, we decided to visit other communist dictatorships around the world. Nicaragua, where I met the socialist dictator Daniel Ortega, whose revolutionary army seized farms and businesses, and where I was treated in a special way, unlike the 14,000 the Sandinistas tortured, raped, and murdered. Cuba, where the dictator Fidel Castro was so busy fundamentally transforming that country that he unfortunately didn't have time to meet me. I admired Castro since I was a kid and thought it was appropriate that poor people were rising up against rather ugly rich people, seizing private farms and businesses and creating a mass network of government informants to spy on dissidents. In all these countries, I saw people lining up for food. That's a good thing. In other countries, people don't line up for food. The rich get the food, and the poor starve to death. I decided to bring some of the policies, like public ownership of the major means of production, to the United States. After moving to Vermont in 1968, I started to run for political office. My platform included a top tax rate of 100%. I insisted that no one should be allowed to earn more than $1 million. I made headlines for speaking truth to power, like telling charity workers that I don't believe in charity, because only the government should provide social services to the needy. finally, after 2 unsuccessful campaigns at 53 years of age, I became mayor of Burlington, Vermont in 1981. As a Democratic Socialist, I then became a congressman. And finally, a senator. In all my 24 years in the Congress, I passed 2 bills to name post offices in Vermont. Since I wasn't that busy being an elected representative, I had a lot of time to write books condemning capitalism and laying out my socialist agenda. This record of accomplishment, my disgust with obscene levels of wealth in America, and my lifelong obsession with income inequality led to the obvious conclusion that I must run for President of the United States. With utopia by my side, we gathered a campaign dream team that included envy and victimhood. We rallied against greed, but as the desire for the unearned, greed was really on our side. We promised free health care, free college tuition, and punishing taxes of up to 90% on the super rich. Because we can't just worship millionaires and billionaires and the making of more money. While I narrowly lost the nomination, I decided to run again. And with the example of my hero Eugene Debs, may keep running for a few more times. Someone has to lead the revolution. And the presidential campaign gig has also helped sell my books. That and my nearly 40 years on the government payroll has made me rich. A multimillionaire with 3 houses, including a lakefront vacation home. Hypocrite? No. Prophet? Yes. Future president? Maybe. But while my political future may be in doubt, one thing never is. I control the narrative. I've seized the moral high ground those who believe in capitalism have failed to defend. And while my imaginary friend Utopia may not have found a home in failed socialist regimes around the world, thanks to me, he's alive and well in the imaginations of voters, especially the young, here in the United States of America.
Democratic Socialism. It's not the same as socialism, because it's democratic, right? Or something, right? People are buying that. People buy that now, right? Apparently. As though adding the word democratic in front of a word changes what it means. Just because we toss something to a vote doesn't change what that something is, nor does it alter whether that something is inherently good or bad. Couple of examples, because I know you'll ask. Hamas was democratically elected as the government in Gaza, despite the fact that the destruction of not only Israel, but the eradication of all Jews is in their official charter. Robert Mugabe, or Bobby Mugabe if you prefer, was democratically elected by a loving majority in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, how's that working out? Venezuela? Well, Hugo Chavez, noted personal favorite and friend of Sean Penn, to whom he constantly pointed as being unfairly characterized as a dictator when in fact he was democratically elected as a socialist. Well, how'd that work out for Venezuela? Well, it's now on the brink of collapse, despite it being one of the most resource-rich nations in the entire world. Basic things like eggs, milk, flour, and toilet paper are either too expensive for the average Venezuelan or simply out of stock. Out of stock, mind you, democratically. I know. Some of you will say, well, that's not fair because really we knew all along it technically was a dictatorship. Okay, that's fair. Let's move on to example number 2. Denmark? Okay, here's the time where you point to an entirely homogeneous population about 1/60th the size of America's, and you point to that as the blueprint. Okay, let's go there. This is a place where the middle class can't even afford a car because of the 180% new car tax. And the prime minister was so fed up with Americans pointing to it as a beacon for socialist success that he felt compelled to clarify, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Sweden? I love Sweden. Okay, great bikini team and Thanks to that country, my armoire now doubles as a bookcase. Speaking of which, the founder of IKEA, let's be honest, the only really cool export from Sweden, aside from a few good hockey players, left Sweden because of the stifling high tax rate. So, Sweden, good place, not bad people, but a successful model for a viable economy in today's global market? Incorrect. The fact is that over time, the greatest enemy of socialism is reality. The reality that human nature will invariably pull certain people toward individualism and success and others toward laziness and collectivism. The tension between the makers and the takers always leads to socialism's inevitable collapse. But I know that I can give you examples of failed socialist economies until I'm blue in the face, and you won't care. Because at least socialism is inherently more morally altruistic than the evil, greedy, capitalist warmongering seen in the West. Greed? What's more greedy than wanting to take from someone else something that you haven't earned? Unlike capitalism, free enterprise, which can only occur truly through voluntary transaction, socialism can only occur at gunpoint. That's what it comes down to. If you don't pay your taxes, once you get through the IRS and the auditing and the lawyers and the PR stunts, people make you give the government your money, an increasing amount of your money, the more successful you are, or they send in scary men with guns to take you away. Now, so long as the people having their stuff taken away at gunpoint are in the minority, and the majority feels that they'll get to benefit from more said taken stuff, you'll always be able to win that decision through a popular vote and claim the moral high ground through democracy. Putting the word democratic in front of your socialism doesn't make it any inherently more moral nor less violent. Did you get that? American wannabe socialists also. Get a job. Please, like a real job. You'll probably have to shave first. I'm Steven Crowder for Prager University.
This is socialism. We can sum up each economic system in one line. Capitalism is based on human greed. Socialism is based on human need, right? No, wrong, so wrong. It's exactly backwards. And I'll prove it to you. Been on Amazon lately? Each of the thousands of products Amazon offers represents the work of people who believe they have something you want or need. If they're right, they prosper. If they're wrong, they don't. That's how the free market works. It encourages people to improve their lives by satisfying the needs of others. No one starts a business making a thing or providing a service for themselves. They start a business to make things or provide services for others. Now, I speak from personal experience. When I was the CEO of the company that owns Carl's Jr. and Hardee's restaurant chains, we spent millions of dollars every year trying to determine what customers wanted. If our customers didn't like something, we changed it, and fast. Because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat us for lunch. The consumer, that's you, has the ultimate power. In effect, you vote with every dollar you spend. In a socialist economy, the government has the ultimate power. It decides what you get from a limited supply it decides should exist. Instead of millions of people making millions of decisions about what they want, a few people, government elites, decide what people should have and how much they should pay for it. Not surprisingly, they always get it wrong. Have you ever noticed that late-stage socialist failures always run out of essential items like toilet paper? Of course, this isn't a problem for those who have the right connections with the right people. Those chosen few get whatever they want. But everyone else is out of luck. Venezuela, once the richest country in South America, is the most recent example of socialism driving a prosperous country into an economic ditch. Now, maybe you think it's an unfair example. I'm not sure why, but okay. We'll ignore the fact that leftist activists celebrated it as a great socialist success right up until it wasn't. But what about Western European countries? Don't they have socialist economies? People seem pretty happy there. Why can't we have what they have? Free healthcare, free college, stronger unions. Good question, and the answer may surprise you. There are no socialist countries in Western Europe. Most are just as capitalist as the United States. The only difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the U.S. does. We can argue about the cost of these benefits and the point at which they reduce individual initiative, thus doing more harm than good. Scandinavians have been debating those questions for years. But only a free market capitalist economy can produce the wealth necessary to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy. To get the free stuff, after all, you have to create enough wealth to generate enough tax revenue to pay for everything the government gives away. Without capitalism, you're Venezuela. In a 2015 speech at Harvard, Denmark's prime minister took great pains to make this point. I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So when you point to Denmark as a paragon of socialism, you're really singing the praises of capitalism. The more capitalism, the less socialism you need. Look at America since 2017. A policy of lower taxes and less government regulation, that's more capitalism, has led to a robust economic expansion, something thought impossible just a few years earlier. Unemployment, notably among minority groups typically most at risk for poverty, is at a generational low. Economic expansion gets people off welfare and into work. That's less socialism. None of this requires a degree in economics. Common sense is all you need. That's why it's so frustrating to see young people praising socialism and criticizing capitalism. It's bad enough that they're working against their own interests. Better job prospects, better wages, personal freedom. But they're also working against the interest of the less fortunate. Capitalism leads to economic democracy. Socialism leads to the economic dictatorship of the elite. Always and everywhere. So beware what you ask for. You just might get it. I'm Andy Puzder, the author of The Capitalist Comeback for Prager University.
We've all heard about how many bad things the U.S. government did to American Indians in the past. But what about today? Like most people, the only time I hear about today's American Indians is when people are outraged about sports mascots or team names, like the Washington Redskins. But sports teams' names are the least of Indians' problems. Did you know that Indians have the highest rate of poverty of any racial group in America? Did you know that alcoholism is more common among Indian youths than among youths in any other ethnic group? Did you know that the rate of child abuse among Indians is twice as high as the national average? Until I visited Indian reservations for my book, The New Trail of Tears, I didn't know any of this. What was at the root of these terrible problems, I wondered? And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that between the 19th century and today, nothing has changed. It's still the government. The two main agencies that oversee the activities of Indians who live on reservations are the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Education, or BIE. Education, economic development, tribal courts, road maintenance, agriculture, and social services. The federal government basically funds and controls all of it. It's no wonder Indians say BIA stands for Bossing Indians Around. Together, these two agencies have combined budgets of $3 billion per year and have 9,000 employees. That's one employee for every 111 Indians on a reservation. Of that $3 billion per year, the BIE uses $850 million of it to educate 42,000 students. That's more than $20,000 per student, compared to a national average of $12,400 per student. Plenty of other federal agencies also have programs for Indians. For instance, the Indian Health Service had a 2015 budget of over $4.6 billion. And yet there are widespread and documented reports of nurses being unable to administer basic drugs, of broken resuscitation equipment, and of unsanitary medical facilities. Obviously, inadequate funding isn't the problem. The billions of dollars that the federal government spends on Indians every year hasn't made their lives better. In fact, by most measures of economic and social health, the lives of American Indians are only getting worse. Aside from issues of culture, the only way out of this morass is economic growth. But the reservation system makes this almost impossible. Following a series of treaties and laws over many decades, some well-intentioned, some not, the federal government decided to hold Indian land, quote, in trust, in order to prevent non-Indians from ever buying that land. But other than Indians, the only people who have things held in trust for them are children and the mentally incompetent. Can anything better illustrate the low regard the government has for American Indians? The awful consequence of this land trust is that Indians can't sell their land, which means they can't use it the same way other Americans do. For example, as collateral to get a loan to start a business. What bank would lend to landowners who don't own their land? The other effect of this absurdity is that Indians can't develop this land that they don't own. Indian reservations contain almost 30% of the nation's coal reserves west of the Mississippi, 50% of potential uranium reserves, and 20% of known oil and gas reserves. Those resources are estimated to be worth nearly $1.5 trillion. But the vast majority of Indian lands with natural resources remain undeveloped because of federal regulations. For instance, for Indians to get permission to mine for coal on Indian land requires 49 steps spanning 4 federal agencies. Each of these 49 steps can take months or years to be approved. There are so many government regulations that just to apply for a permit to dig a hole cost $6,500. Is it really any wonder that this community is mired in poverty? So what can be done? For starters, end the trust system. Let Indians do what they want with the land they own. Get the massive federal bureaucracy out of the way. Give American Indians the opportunity to embrace the same thing that has lifted millions of other people out of poverty and into the middle class, free enterprise. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy, but it will do a lot more for American Indians than changing the name of the Washington Redskins.
2017, Romania's prime minister passed an executive order making it almost impossible to convict high-level officials for abuses of power. He said that the law was a way to ease pressure on the country's overcrowded prisons. However, critics accused him of using it to free some of his political allies from corruption charges. After news broke, thousands of Romanians poured into the streets in the country's largest uprising in nearly 3 decades. European countries are generally seen as examples of fairness and transparency in government, with countries like Denmark and Switzerland consistently ranking among the least corrupt. However, in much of Eastern Europe, including Romania, bribery and other forms of corruption are still a part of daily life. So why is there this discrepancy? Well, much of Eastern Europe was either part of or aligned with the Soviet Union. This meant that these countries had centralized economies, where everything from production to prices to individual incomes was controlled by the state. In economies where everything is equal, incentives for demanding and offering bribes are high, and it's often the only way to function as a business. This culture of corruption was only exacerbated under Soviet-era dictators, who built loyal regimes that ruled long after the Soviet Union fell. To understand how this works, look no further than Romania, a country that was communist for more than 3 decades. This started in the aftermath of World War II, when the Soviet Union took the country under its wing as a satellite state. In 1965, Nicolae Ceausescu took over, and although he distanced the country from the USSR, he created his own, more repressive brand of communism. Ceausescu transformed Romania into an industrialized, closed-off economy, resulting in a nearly 10% drop in economic growth, widespread unemployment, and extreme shortages of food, energy, and other necessities. Meanwhile, he became a brutal and oppressive dictator, enforcing strict controls on media and opposition, and ordering the arrest, torture, and execution of thousands of people. This eventually culminated in a violent revolution and coup d'etat, and in 1989, Ceausescu and his wife were executed. Romania then began to make democratic reforms. But Romanians failed to see that Ceausescu was only the tip of the iceberg. During his reign, he built a huge politically like-minded regime, which for more than a decade after the revolution maintained a major stake in politics. Although Romanians had gotten rid of Ceausescu, they hadn't purged his foundations. So many of the same abuses of power continued. This problem was not uncommon among post-communist states in Eastern Europe. During the process of privatization, corrupt relationships formed between politicians and corporations, leading to bribes and kickbacks. What's more, many members of the elite were able to hold on to their wealth and power by laundering money and rigging elections. After the Soviet Union fell, many countries established democratic institutions, but they failed to get rid of corrupt individuals and norms, which in some cases continue today. In fact, many of Romania's modern politicians are former communists or have connections to the Communist Party. With abuses of power so deeply rooted in history and culture, rooting it out completely may take more than a revolution. And even with its enduring legacy of corruption, Romania is still far cleaner than this country, which consistently ranks as Europe's most corrupt. Want to know more? Check out this video. Thanks for watching Seeker Daily. Don't forget to like and subscribe for new videos.
Once there was a South American country with a promising future. It had a functioning democracy, a rapidly developing economy, and a growing middle class. All the important indicators, including education, healthcare, and foreign investment, were pointed in the right direction. It was far from perfect, but the mood was hopeful, and with good reason. But now all that promise is gone. The country is a failed state, a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Services like power and water are sporadic. The most basic consumer goods, from bread to toilet paper, are in chronically short supply. Crime has skyrocketed. Freedom of the press is almost non-existent. Democracy has been replaced by a virtual dictatorship. The country is, I'm sorry to say, my beloved Venezuela, a place in which my family has deep roots. I can tell you what happened to it in one word: socialism. In 1999, then candidate for president Hugo Chavez promised to lead the people of Venezuela to a socialist paradise. His theme was Esperanza y Cambio, hope and change. Venezuela is a nation of great wealth, Chavez said, but it's being stolen from its citizens by the evil capitalists and evil corporations. This wrong would be righted, he assured the voters, if they elected him. And they did, to their everlasting regret. Chavez drew inspiration from his mentor, Fidel Castro. Like his mentor, he enjoyed giving speeches that sometimes lasted as many as 7 hours. He even gave himself his own weekly television show, where he would spontaneously break into song. Here's a rule: when your nation's leader starts singing on national television, you're in trouble. Under Chavez, the government of Venezuela took over industry after industry. The government, he assured everyone, would run these businesses better than private enterprise, and the profits would be shared by the people. With great fanfare, he tore up contracts with multinational oil and gas companies and demanded that they pay much higher royalties. When they refused, he told them to leave. They did. His image was burnished by Hollywood celebrities who flocked to see the great work he was doing, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. Progressive politicians from the U.S. and Europe also praised him, lavishly. Here's another rule: when Hollywood celebrities visit your country to praise your leader, you're in trouble. When the leader sings on national television and is praised by Hollywood celebrities, you're doomed. Socialism always works in the beginning, so people are fooled in the beginning. It's easy for governments to confiscate money, but eventually, there's no more money to confiscate. In the case of Venezuela, I mean that literally. People who could get money out of the country did. Many left the country altogether. Nearly 2 million, according to Venezuelan sociologist Tomás Paez. The wealth creators continued to create wealth, but they created it somewhere else, Miami or Madrid, and other places around the world. When Chavez first ran for president in 1999, he said he would leave in 2 years if people weren't happy with him. But, like Castro, Chavez never had any intention of giving up power. He died in office in 2013, replaced by his vice president, Nicolás Maduro. Maduro is Chavez without the charisma or the voice. The country is now a pariah, shunned by the world and isolated. It's so bad that many international airlines refuse to fly there. People stand in lines for hours just to get food. Sometimes they walk away empty-handed. A recent survey found that 75% of Venezuelan adults lost weight in 2016, an average of 19 pounds. This national weight loss program is known cynically as the Maduro diet. Still, Maduro holds on to power. Opposition leaders and journalists who report the truth are jailed. Venezuela is a cautionary tale. Once a country goes down a socialist path, there's no easy way back. And the longer a country stays socialist, the harder it is to reform it. Venezuela has been socialist for 2 decades. If you don't think it can happen here, whether here is the United States or Europe or anywhere else, you're fooling yourself. When people get used to depending on the government, no matter how poor they remain, that dependency is hard to break. That's why you should never buy the socialist lie. Socialism is a drug, and like a drug, it feels great at first, but eventually it will ruin your country, just like it ruined Venezuela. I'm Debbie D'Souza for Prager University.
Is socialism. This is what more than half of young people believes needs to be implemented in the United States. My name is Morgan Zeggers, and I started Young Americans Against Socialism because I'm sick of seeing the growing support for socialism when it's capitalism that has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system in our history. We are facing a problem in our country. Our education system is failing to tell the truth and educate our youth on the disastrous impact real socialism has had on every country it has touched. Meanwhile, young people are consuming hours of social media each day, which is dominated by leftist propaganda, pulling at their emotions while negating basic economics and history. If we continue this trend, the country is lost. Our forefathers, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, everything they fought for will be lost. I'm not going to let that happen. Young Americans Against Socialism is taking the left's tactics of injecting emotion into every story and throwing it right back in their faces. Because we have something they don't, facts to go along with it. We're telling the real stories of those who have lived through the hell of socialism.
My name is Ray, and I escaped socialism in Cuba, windsurfing, for 10 hours. I'd reached the conclusion that I would take the decision to put my head under the water and take 3 deep breaths of water. And I would die drowning with a big smile on my face because I knew I was free. This is the first time in my life I was free. So if you're one of those wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, first of all, I'm sorry to say, but you're an ignorant. The only difference between Che Guevara and Hitler, the scale of what they did.
My name is Daniel DiMartino, and I am here to tell you that socialism destroyed my life in Venezuela, and it can destroy yours here too.
Sometimes American journalists talk about how bad a country is because people are lining up for food. That's a good thing. In other countries, people don't line up for food. The rich get the food and the poor starve to death.
I had to make those lines Bernie Sanders talked about. And it wasn't because I was rich, but because politicians like him destroyed my country.
My name is Gaby Franco, and I am the first female shooter to represent Venezuela in the Olympics. The common phrase of, you don't know what you have until you lose it, was a bit different for me. I didn't know what I didn't have until I found it. The Second Amendment. That gives me the right to protect myself from attackers, including my own government.
These are the true stories of victims of socialism that we have told so far, and we're looking to tell so many more.
Hi, my name is Bill Montgomery, and I started Turning Point USA with Charlie Kirk, which many consider to be the most successful organization reaching out to young people. When I first met Morgan and heard her idea for an organization that would reach out to the youth of this country using the one thing that they all seem to use, social media, I then said I needed to help her.
The success of this idea is based on our lean and mean strategy that allows us to efficiently reach millions of young Americans each month. But we need your help. To save the future of this country, we need to make as many of these videos as possible, telling the powerful and emotional stories that expose young Americans to the true, devastating impact of socialism. If you have lived through the hell of socialism, please go to our website and let us know. Your story deserves to be heard, and we want to help you tell it.
We need your financial support in order to continue to produce these high-quality videos that reach millions and awaken the youth to the evils of socialism. Make your donation to Yaz today.
Venezuela is a country in crisis. It's an entirely man-made crisis. It was the richest country in South America and now has a poverty rate of 87%. GDP has dropped 40% in the last 5 years. And if the IMF's current figures prove correct, it will have halved in that period. It had the largest oil reserves in the world, and yet its oil industry is now a basket case. Chavez replaced his 4,000 skilled oil workers by 100,000 party hacks, who proved to be both corrupt and incompetent. The Chavistas have crippled private businesses, down from 13,000 to just 4,000 now. Arbitrary seizures, impositions of price controls that businesses were unable to produce at. Farming has collapsed. Medical infrastructure has fallen apart. Even basic services. Cuts to power and water are commonplace. Deaths in childbirth, up 65%. Deaths in infancy, up 30%. And all of this is in the last few years. There's been a lack of basic services, lack of basic medications, vaccines. Conquerable diseases such as malaria, which had been wiped out, have returned. Inflation is over 1,000,000%. Everywhere there are shortages. Savings have been wiped out. The country is laid low in a tragedy for its peoples. 3 million have fled and more want to flee. And all of this has been caused by a failed ideology. Socialism has been given one more go, and it has shown us all one more failure. The government borrowed recklessly to fund handouts to its party hacks, its loyalists. It has repressed opposition. It's killed people demonstrating in the streets for better lives. It is a brutal dictatorship that has impoverished its people and fed them slogans in place of food. The world has finally begun to act to do something about this. We all have a part to play. What must happen now is that a bandit government must be replaced by a competent and responsible one. Obviously, the Venezuelan people and South America must play the lead role, but we all have a part to play, and it's time we played it.
But here's the thing about Marxism. At what point are we going to say, okay, we have enough evidence? We've tried it 100 times, over 100 years, on every continent. And the results are 100 million civilians have been killed. Entire cultures and civilizations have been completely and totally destroyed.
Hey, let's try it in America.
Yeah, let's just bring it to the most prosperous, the richest, the most benevolent, creative, greatest country ever to exist. Let's bring the single ideology that has never worked and has destroyed entire civilizations. It destroyed Zimbabwe. It destroyed Cuba. It destroyed the entire Cuban Peninsula. It destroyed Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Every Soviet Union country, from Belarus to Bulgaria to Ukraine, all of Russia, destroyed Afghanistan. They tried it in India, it didn't work. They tried it in Afghanistan, it didn't work. They tried it in Pakistan, it didn't work. They tried it in Northern Africa, it didn't work. They tried it in Spain, they tried it in Portugal, they tried it in France, they tried it in Italy. And yet they say, we have never tried socialism. Oh, really? 100 times over 100 years on every single continent, with every culture, every background, every language, every religion, and not one time can they point to an example that socialism ever worked. But of course, if they bring it here.
And they try to repackage it. They hyphenate it. It's democratic socialism, which means you get to elect to ruin your country. I mean, that's pretty much what that means.
That's right. You can choose death. Yeah. Oh, great.
Our generation is thinking socialism's a good idea. It's like greater than 50%. It's just alarming. But then you ask them, how many of you know what socialism is? And I know you do. But if you ask your compatriot, it's like 10 or 12% and think or understand that it means ownership. It means the government ownership of the means of production. They think it's sort of like, well, we want people to be fair. We want things to be equal. But they're not thinking through the steps of the violence, the state-sponsored violence that it takes to make everybody equal. When you talk to people and you say, well, what about Stalin and what about Hitler and what about Mao? They'll just say those were aberrations. You know, those were accidents of history. But Hayek had a different way of looking at it. Hayek looked at it and he said, well, if you want complete socialism, if you want to have the government completely own the means of production, including the houses, the farms, and everything, maybe you have to select for a leader who's ruthless because that's the only way you can get it from people. So let's say you have a really kind, benign dictator, and he's elected or she's elected democratically, and it's like, but you got to take all the houses. Maybe the benign dictator doesn't work very well. Maybe if you really want complete socialism, maybe you have to select for the most ruthless. But we need to be reminded of it. And the left will say, oh, that's not what we mean, that's not what we're talking about. But we do need to be reminded of it.
Face it, you don't find too many socialists in elective office in this country, and one is elected mayor of a sizable city. Well, that's news. It's also Phil Donahue's topic this morning.
Good morning, Jane. A couple of facts. Burlington is the largest city in Vermont. The state has about 500,000 people. Burlington has about 38,000. Situated as it is on Lake Champlain with the Adirondack Mountains view, viewable. It's a lovely, lovely spot in this country. We'd like you to meet its new mayor. This is Mayor Bernard Sanders. Mayor Sanders got a lot of attention recently, not only with his 10-vote victory out of about 9,500 votes cast, but mostly because he is a socialist. And everybody reading that article said, my goodness, how did this happen in good old conservative Vermont? How do you respond?
Well, in Vermont, being conservative is different perhaps than being conservative elsewhere in the country. Also, what I think most people don't know is Vermont happens to be one of the very poorest states in the country. And although we're a little bit better off in Burlington, we still have enormous economic problems. I won the election, I think, because we effectively put together a coalition of low-income people, elderly people who in Vermont are very often up against the wall economically, in very bad shape. Some of our city trade unions.
The cops supported you, didn't they?
The police department supported us, yes. The Patrolmen's Association did, right.
So you had police officers voting for you who probably voted for Ronald Reagan.
Well, I'm not so sure that I don't know, if I can say
that. But that's certainly...
But the police officers in our particular city are earning, they're trade unionists. And they're earning very low wages, and along with many other workers in our city, want some fundamental change. Also, we have in our city particular problems, I believe, with the police department that they've been concerned about, very low morale. So it didn't particularly surprise me.
How are Vermont conservatives different than national conservatives?
It's not big money conservatism. It's not right-wingism and warmongerism. In fact, Vermont has always had a very strong feeling about civil liberties. What conservatism means in Vermont basically is leave me alone, get the government off my back, and that's fine. It's a respect for other people's rights. We disagree, we'll talk it out. And that's a very different conservatism that says, let's go to war, supranationalism, and so forth.
If I were the president of the largest bank in Burlington, I'd be real nervous about you.
Well, they may be. They may be. But I think, and they are. But I think what we've often talked about also is that my powers as mayor are in many ways limited. And I have my visions as to what life should be in Vermont, in Burlington, and in the United States. But within Burlington, I acknowledge everybody knows what my powers are, and they're very limited.
Right.
We're not going to go around nationalizing banks or nationalizing industry. In fact, we want industry in Vermont that pay decent wages, and we're going to go out and bring that in like every other mayor in the United States is. We are going to speak out, though, on national and international issues which affect the city of Burlington. For example, obviously, we're very concerned about Mr. Reagan's policies, which are impacting devastatingly on low-income and working people. We're concerned about the policies in our own state government, which are affecting low-income people negatively.
Yeah.
But we know what our powers are within the city of Burlington.
When you sit around with your own friends talking about the world here, how we got here, where we're going, what's the biggest grievance? Give us your overview.
All right, what we're talking about is that we believe in democracy. I mean, the problem with the word socialism is that very often it's been equated with what happens in the Soviet Union, which is authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I believe very strongly in the right of dissent, and I think people with my ideas fight for those things very strongly. What we talk about is the fact that in our society, theoretically a democratic society, you have a handful of people who control our economy. You have maybe 2% of the population that owns 1/3 of the entire wealth of America, 80% of the stocks, 90% of the bonds. And these people have incredible power. They sit on huge corporations like the Chase Manhattan Bank, the multinational corporations, and they determine the destiny of our entire country. As you know, perhaps 50% of our population has so given up on the democratic process, they don't even vote, and those are primarily poor people.
Your state is thought of as not only beautiful, but the place you go to get away from all that big city smut and soot and all the crud and you've got those wonderful ski areas. Hooray, let's go. More tourism for Vermont. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's yes and no. I think we don't object to people coming into Vermont to spend money. That's fine. But we do know within our own state, we happen to be, sadly, one of the very poorest states in America. And many of the people in Vermont themselves cannot afford to go to the downhill skiing. We do more cross-country skiing. It's cheaper. What we are talking about is the kind of development that will provide decent jobs for our people. Very often, and this is a concern within our own state, is that industries such as the skiing industry and other tourist-attracting industries in Vermont, all over the country, and all over the world, they provide very low-paying menial jobs. I'm not particularly proud that our state becomes a state where we have chambermaids and people waiting on other people. We would rather see our people doing meaningful, productive-type jobs where they can earn a decent wage.
Can you go to all those lunches, all of those banquets with the dais and the speeches and the cream chicken and all the wonderful Chamber of Commerce? Here we are, moving on.
Well, what I have said back home, and I say it again, is that our office is open. I've already talked to a number of business people. We will communicate. We're not shutting out anybody. But what I have also said is that what my concern is for the low-income people who are unemployed, who are working at minimum wage jobs, for the kids who are in Vermont as throughout the country. They're left out. They have no sense of purpose.
But everybody says that, Mayor.
well, they're going to be coming into our door.
Do you want a tax, especially for people who make more than $25,000 a year?
Well, that for individuals, perhaps not for families. That's too low. You know, we have husbands and wives.
But you would consider legislation that would tax the wealthy?
Absolutely. We want to take the burden off low-income and working people, and you've got to go to those institutions, those corporations, and those individuals who can better afford to pay.
You surprised everybody with this victory, including media. And not all media has been consistently attentive to you. Isn't that right?
I think what people were saying is, well, gee, Ronald Reagan is a right-wing guy, and what happened in Burlington, Vermont? And I think the answer to that is, I don't believe personally that the majority of people in America believe in Ronald Reagan's ideology. What happened was that Jimmy Carter failed. I think that's just clear as everybody, Mr. Carter would probably admit it. And people are looking for an alternative. Mr. Reagan, with hundreds of millions of dollars behind him, with sophisticated media use and so forth and so on, was able to say to the people, we are the alternative. Now, obviously, what we are trying to do, people like myself all around the country are saying, wait a minute, you're going to find out very soon that this guy is not the alternative. There are other alternatives.
Okay. I know these are terribly complicated questions, and our time is up, but are you a capitalist?
No, I'm not a capitalist.
So you don't believe in the profit motive, free enterprise? If I have a better mousetrap, I make more money?
There's something to be said for free enterprise on a local level and the competition. But what we're happening in our society is we don't live in a free enterprise society. You live in a corporate capitalist society where in virtually every single industry you have giant multi-billion-dollar corporations competing, driving the small businessman
But let's
out.
pretend it would work without all that kind of acquisition of power that is unfair and doesn't...
Do I believe that the profit motive is fundamental to human nature? The answer is no. I think the spirit of cooperation, that you and I can work together better rather than having to compete against each other and destroy each other.
Bernard Sanders, Mayor, Burlington, Vermont.
Ever notice whenever you talk to a socialist, then bring up the examples of previous socialist regimes, they always say that wasn't socialism. Soviet Union apparently wasn't socialism. Cuba wasn't socialism. All the countries that have been tried in China and everywhere else wasn't socialism. But recently there was one example, a very contemporary example, that socialists, including the Labour left, Jeremy Corbyn and everyone, have been quite proud to say that this is a successful socialist project. And because it was very recent, they can't deny it. Venezuela is a country that had a very rich history and culture, economically and politically, with democracy and everything, and until Hugo Chavez and his gang came into power. Now, what happened in Venezuela? This happened. In the words of Jeremy Corbyn and his friends, this is real socialism. People starving on the street, getting murdered by their government, not being able to get a job, buy food, buy clothes. That's real socialism. Although recently they've changed their tactic. Then if you ask your typical Labour left person and a typical socialist activist, they say, well, Venezuela is failing just a little bit because of American sanctions and because it's not socialist enough. I don't know how much socialist does he have to get for these people to realize this doesn't work. It's quite simple. They don't care about ordinary people and the effects it has on their lives. They just care about the cuckoo land, their ideology, their fantasy land. And as long as that still is implemented, regardless of if it fails or succeeds, they're happy. But let's have a look at some facts. According to IMF experts, they estimate that inflation in Venezuela will reach 10 million% by the end of 2019. That means a product that at one point cost the equivalent of $1 will now cost the equivalent of $10 million. During most of the decades following Venezuela's adoption of a democratic government in 1958 through to the 1980s, the country was the richest nation in South America. But the policies that resulted in this chaos, obviously in the eyes of an ordinary person with common sense or someone who understands economics, is stupid and crazy. But in the eyes of a normal socialist person in the West, they're actually quite normal. It's nothing outrageous. They've done price controls, they've introduced extremely high minimum wage, they've obviously nationalized all the industries. These are the sort of things that a certain someone is in favor of. Do you remember? Jeremy Corbyn. For example, President Maduro has ordered 26 minimum wage increases in his 6 years in office, including a 300% increase earlier this year. But this is why we still have Labour members, including Jeremy Corbyn, Chris Williamson, John McDonnell and Ken Livingstone, supporting the Venezuelan government and obviously blaming all the issues on America and everything else.
Chris Williamson. Mr. Speaker, the Venezuelan economy has been crippled by US sanctions, and the The UN rapporteur, the first UN rapporteur to visit the country for 21 years, is quoted as saying this, Mr. Speaker: US sanctions on the country are illegal and could amount